What nobody tells you about the most dangerous men in the city is that most of them just need sleep. The loud ones with tempers and bodyguards, they're not the ones to worry about. It's the quiet ones, the ones who own blocks and move money through Chicago like water through old pipes. Those men are tired in a way that has no prescription and no fix, and no name that any doctor has found useful. I know that because I met one at 4 a.m. in November, standing outside my bakery window in the dark, and he didn't knock. He just stood there breathing. And the look on his face was one I'd seen before. Not on powerful men specifically, but on people who had been awake so long they'd forgotten what the other side felt like. I did not build Stone and Rye because I had run out of other options. I built it because I was done letting other people put their names above my work. 3 years before that November, I'd been sous chef at Bancroft's in the Gold Coast, the kind of place where the menus changed seasonally and the walls were so clean, they made you feel underdressed for just standing in them. I developed our signature sourdough over 8 months. It was the bread people mentioned in reviews. The bread that made the tables go quiet on first bite. Chef Renner called it a pleasant discovery of the kitchen in the James Beard nomination that had my formula in it and his name at the top. I gave my 2 weeks' notice on a Tuesday. He didn't look surprised. That told me everything about him and nothing useful about myself. Stone and Rye opened the following spring in a narrow storefront on Randolph Street with second-hand equipment. One window I kept spotless because light matters more than square footage, and a starter I'd been feeding for 2 years that I carried to the new kitchen, wrapped in a cloth like something living, because it was. I baked through the night and opened at 4 because that's when people are honest. Night shift nurses from Northwestern came in with scrubs that smelled like antiseptic and said, "Thank you," like they meant it. Cab drivers doubled parked and ate standing up and left without waiting for change. An old man I'd taken to calling Mr. Kowalski came every single morning at 4:15, sat in the chair by the window, drank 2 coffees in silence, never said a word before the second one was done, and then told me exactly what he thought of the bread with the gravity of a man who had once judged things that actually mattered. He usually thought well of it. On the days he had notes, the notes were right. Those were my regulars, that was my floor, mine. I'd been open 14 months when the black SUVs started showing up. The first one I barely noticed. Rich people moved through the West Loop at strange hours in expensive cars. The second one I noticed because it idled too long. The third pulled up behind the second, and I stopped pretending not to watch. One hand on the shelf where I kept my phone, the other near the bread knife I'd had since culinary school, and still sharpened every Sunday without exception. 3 vehicles, no noise, nobody got out. Then one rear door opened and just one man stepped onto the sidewalk. He didn't move like a man looking for trouble. He moved like a man who had been following something he couldn't explain. A smell, maybe, or the light in the window, or something that registered below thought and pulled him across the sidewalk before he'd decided to come. He stopped at the glass and looked in. His coat was dark and expensive. At this distance, his face was hard to read, but I didn't need to read it closely. I knew the particular stillness that lived in people who had not slept properly in a very long time. I buzzed him in because I had already made the decision before I finished the thought. He stepped inside, and the cold November came in with him, and he stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds doing nothing except breathing. Not looking at me, not looking at the bread racks. Just standing there in the warm air with his eyes closed, taking it in like a man who had surfaced from somewhere dark and was still deciding whether the air was safe. "How much for a slice?" he asked. His voice was low and steady, in the particular way voices get when someone has trained themselves out of using volume as leverage. $4, I said. Sourdough with butter and sea salt or the rosemary plain. Either one, he said. I cut him the rosemary, thick, still warm from the last pull, spread butter while it could still melt, pushed the plate across the counter. He took it without sitting down. He ate standing by the display case with the focused quiet of a man eating something he hadn't known he was missing. He set a 50 on the counter when he finished. I gave him back $46. He looked at the change in his palm. "You're serious," he said. "Bread is $4, I said. That's the price. He considered me for a moment, dark eyes, more awake than the rest of his face. Then he pocketed the change without another word, walked back out, and all 3 SUVs pulled away together. Nina told me the next morning during the 6:15 lull between the night shift crowd and the early commuters. She said the name the way people say names that carry weight. Not loud, not dramatic, just careful, the way you set something fragile on a surface before stepping back. Conrad Thorne. I knew enough. Everybody in Chicago knew enough. Real estate in Bridgeport, Pilsen, and 2 blocks of the near South Side. Warehousing along the river. The kind of name that lived in the background of things, in half-finished warnings, in the particular quiet that fell when it came up at the wrong table, in investigations that got quietly reclassified, and rivals who relocated to other cities instead of pressing their cases. I swept the floor and thought it over, and decided it changed nothing. He came back the next morning at 4:12. No convoy this time, just him and one other man who stood near the entrance with his hands loose at his sides, mid-50s, silver at the temples, a face designed to put people at ease until you noticed how much information it was quietly collecting. Conrad took Mr. Kowalski's usual chair, which was available because Mr. Kowalski hadn't arrived yet, and I put a whole small rosemary loaf in front of him, without asking, and poured him a coffee, because he looked like a man who needed both, and would not request either. He ate half the loaf before he said a word. "What time do you close?" he asked. "Noon," I said, "sometimes 1 if I'm behind on prep." "You're here every morning." "Every morning," I said. He nodded and went back to the bread. He left $20 on the table. I put 16 of it in the jar by the register that went to the shelter on Paulina. Ray was the silver-templed man's name. He told me so himself when he came alone one weekday afternoon, while I was shaping the next day's battards, and he sat at the counter and folded his hands on the marble, and told me things without first asking my permission, which I respected more than he knew. Men who ask permission before saying hard things tend to be performing concern rather than expressing it. He told me Conrad's wife had been killed 3 years ago. Her name was Isabel. They'd been at home, a dinner with people Conrad considered safe, and one of those people had not been. Conrad had survived. Isabel had not. He'd been there. He'd seen what happened and been unable to stop it. Since that night, he hadn't slept through to morning without finding himself back in that room, and no doctor, no medication, no amount of anything had reached. Whatever part of him was still standing at that kitchen table, watching someone he loved die in front of him. The last 3 mornings, Ray said, he slept, 5 until nearly noon. He doesn't know I'm here. Then why are you? I asked. He looked past me at the morning loaves cooling on the rack. Because the bread didn't flinch, he said. That was not an answer. It was also exactly an answer. I set my conditions before Conrad arrived the next morning, while he was still coming through the door, and before he had a chance to get comfortable, because conditions land better when the other person isn't yet settled. I said them plainly. He was not my project. I was not his solution. I was not going to rearrange my life around the fact that his body had found something in my bread that it had apparently stopped finding everywhere else. If he wanted to come in at 4 a.m. and eat and be left alone, that was fine with me. If he brought a security detail that made my regulars nervous, if he brought trouble through my door, if he treated my bakery like an extension of whatever world he lived in the rest of the time, he could find another place to be. He listened to all of it without moving or interrupting. When I finished, he said, "What's the rosemary loaf cost for a whole one?" $7, I said. "I'll take one every morning," he said. And that was that. November became December, became a routine I deliberately did not examine too closely. He came before the other regulars most days, sometimes before I'd turned the front lights on, and sat in his corner and ate while I worked, and we talked the way people talk when they're both more comfortable with silence than most. In short, honest pieces, without the performance of it. He asked about the bread in the way that meant he actually wanted to know, not just to fill the air, and I told him about fermentation times and the difference between a commercial starter and one you'd been feeding for years, and he listened like it was worth listening to. Which it was, but which most people had to be reminded of. He mentioned Fern once, in a way that suggested he hadn't fully planned to. His daughter, 9 years old, living with his sister in Evanston, where it was safer, and he saw her on weekends. She was afraid of the dark, so he read to her over the phone on the nights he couldn't be there. Chapter books now, after years of picture books, his voice going through the pages while she held her nightlight until she fell asleep. He said it was the only hour of the day where he was completely certain he was doing something right. That detail got under my skin in a way I spent the next 3 days not talking about. The trouble came in January, the way trouble usually comes when someone with money and a grievance gets impatient. A city health inspector arrived with a clipboard and 2 code officers and a list of violations that had not existed before that morning. I pulled every permit, every certification, every food handling license, every renewal confirmation, the clean inspection record from 8 months prior. I laid them on the counter one at a time, while the officers studied the floor tiles, and the inspector studied his shoes, and the 2 women waiting in line behind them watched me with the particular satisfaction of watching someone quietly dismantle something that deserved to be dismantled. The inspector gathered his papers and left without citing a single thing, because there was nothing to cite. 3 nights later, someone put a rock through the glass front of my display case. Not the door, not the main window, just the case, precise, expensive to replace, and ugly to see. Surgical. A message written in somebody else's handwriting on something I had built. Conrad was on my step at 4, the next morning, earlier than usual. I was already inside sweeping. He came in without knocking and stood looking at the boarded plywood where the case had been. "I know who," he said. "I know you do," I said. "Let me deal with it." I set the broom against the counter. "If you deal with it," I said, "then what happened to my case becomes part of your war, and I become a reason for your war, and I didn't agree to any of that when I handed you bread at 4 in the morning." "You're already in it," he said. "That's what I'm trying to explain to you." "There's a difference," I said, "between being a target and being a reason. I'm asking you not to make me the second one." He was quiet. Outside, first light was barely starting to gray the building tops, that thin moment before dawn when the city looks like it hasn't decided yet whether to try again. "I know the difference," he said. "Then act like it," I said. He didn't argue. That was the thing about Conrad Thorne I kept running into. When I said something true, he just let it land. No reframing, no counter. I had never met a man who did that consistently, and I found it more unsettling than any argument could have been. Alden Cross escalated the way men without patience escalate, through paper and intermediaries first, then more directly. My flour supplier of 14 months called on a Thursday morning to say the contract was being discontinued, no explanation offered. My landlord sent a text asking to revisit the lease terms. A noise complaint appeared on my door regarding delivery trucks before 5 a.m., which was genuinely absurd. My deliveries came at 6, and the only thing running at 4 was my spiral mixer, which was quieter than most residential alarm clocks. Ray came by on a Friday afternoon and laid out what Conrad was offering: a commercial kitchen space in River North, full equipment, staff available if I wanted it, lease in my name only, no strings on paper or off it. "Tell him no," I said. Ray nodded. "He thought you would." "Then why send you?" "Because he wanted you to know the offer existed," Ray said. "Not to change your mind, just so you knew it was made." I thought about that while I shaped the afternoon's loaves. The fact that he'd sent Ray to inform me, rather than persuade me, said more than the offer itself. I'd planned the soft opening for the spring menu as a small, low-key thing. Just regulars. A couple of industry people, and Cass, a food writer who'd been one of the first people to put Stone and Rye in print back when I was figuring out if the business would survive its first spring. 15 people at most. New spreads. The white bean and lamb stew I'd been developing since October. Fresh bread, obviously. Conrad arrived at 7. No convoy, just him and Ray posted near the back wall. He took a plate and stood by the window and watched the room the way he always watched rooms, not searching for anything specific but aware of everything at once. I watched him from the kitchen doorway once, for a moment I wasn't supposed to have. Cass had said something that made him laugh. Small laugh, fast, gone before it fully arrived. But for the 2 seconds it lasted, the hollowness was completely gone from his face. He just looked like a person laughing at a party, tired maybe, but present, real. I went back to the oven. Cross's men came through the alley door at 9:15. I heard the rack go over before I saw them, the metal shelving unit hitting the tile, with the particular sound of something falling that was not meant to fall. I came through the kitchen doorway with the cast iron skillet already in my hand, because my hand had found it before my brain caught up, and 7 years behind commercial ovens had made certain responses faster than thought. The first man through the door got the flat of the skillet and went sideways into the prep table. I'm not going to apologize for that. He came into my kitchen. Conrad was already moving past me. I had seen fast people in restaurant kitchens before, people who'd worked the line for 20 years, and could move 6 plates and a sauté pan without spilling a drop. Conrad was faster. The second man had enough time to understand that the room had been seriously miscalculated before it was over. Cross walked through my front door like he'd been invited. He was older than I'd expected. Smooth, the kind of handsome that takes years to curdle into what it really is, and his had fully arrived. He looked around my bakery with the mild amusement of a man surveying damage he'd ordered from a comfortable distance. And when he looked at Conrad, he said something about comfort and weakness, and what happened to men who acquired soft habits. Conrad said nothing. The quiet around him was more threatening than any response. I stepped to the front of my kitchen and looked at Cross directly. "You are standing in my bakery," I said. "I have bread in my oven that I've been working on since 2 this morning, and I would rather finish this night without blood on my floor, so I'm going to ask you once to go back through whatever door you came in." He looked at me with that smile, and I picked up the jar of chili oil from the shelf beside me. I'd been making infused oils all week, jars lined along the counter, and I held it in my hand without yet doing anything with it, because the most effective threat is the one still pending. Cross glanced at the jar, then at Conrad, then at Ray, who had appeared somewhere behind him, without making a sound that anyone had caught. "Get out of my bakery," I said again, and this time I meant it in the way that didn't require a second repetition. He got out. The police arrived 40 minutes later. Cass sat in the corner through all of it, with her coffee and her notebook, and told me afterward it was the most interesting evening she'd tried to write around without actually writing. Conrad stayed and helped me stack the chairs that had been knocked over. He held the dustpan while I swept broken crockery, without once suggesting he had something better to do. At 10 o'clock his phone lit up on the counter with Fern's name on it. He stepped outside to take it. I could see him through the window, the way his whole body changed in the first 30 seconds, the shoulders coming down, the jaw unclenching. His face turning towards the streetlight with something moving across it I can only describe as relief. He laughed once, real, quick, entirely unguarded. He was back inside 10 minutes. "She wanted to make sure I'd eaten," he said. "Had you?" He looked at me. I made him the white bean and lamb stew I'd meant for the evening. He ate the whole bowl. Then he sat at the counter while I finished cleaning, and we talked about ordinary things. Fern's new thing about collecting rocks from the lakefront, whether the rosemary loaf would work with a smoked salt instead, what Chicago winters did to old brick that Chicago summers couldn't undo. By midnight the room was quiet and reset, and he was still at the counter. "Cross is going to keep going," I said. "For about 2 more weeks," Conrad said. I didn't ask what that meant. I had already decided there were parts of his world I didn't need the details of. The same way there were parts of mine he'd never need to follow into kitchen corridors at 2 in the morning, after someone had taken something that wasn't theirs. Cross was gone from Chicago before February. Nobody explained it to me, nobody was expected to. The bakery reopened on a Tuesday, with a new display case I'd ordered in walnut trim instead of the original chrome, because if I was replacing it, I was replacing it as something better. The hand-lettered sign I redid on the window myself. Cass's piece ran in the magazine that weekend, not about Cross, not about Conrad, not about any of the things that had happened. Just about the bread, about Stone and Rye and what it meant to build something in a neighborhood that had been reinvented 6 times, and still didn't always know what it wanted to be. She called my sourdough the best in the city. She called me stubborn in a way that was entirely a compliment. The Saturday after the piece ran, Fern came in. Conrad brought her just after 6, before the weekend line built, and she walked through the door the way 9-year-olds walk into rooms they've decided matter. Seriously, taking everything in. She had his eyes. Dark, careful, noticing. She shook my hand with both of hers like she'd been told that was the right way to do it and had decided to commit fully. And then she looked at the morning rack and asked if she could touch one of the loaves. 10 more minutes to cool, I said. Then you can shape your own if you want. She looked at her father for confirmation. He nodded once. She turned back to me with an expression close to reverence, which is exactly the right response to fresh bread, and I told her so. I taught her the boule that morning. She was better at it than most adults I'd shown. Steady hands, patient, not over-squeezing. She understood instinctively that the dough needed to be guided, not forced. Conrad stood near the wall and watched without a word. When Fern held up her finished loaf for him to see, the expression on his face was the one I'd seen that one night through the window. The open, unguarded one, with no hollowness left in it. I turned back to my own shaping so I didn't have to pretend I hadn't noticed. She named her loaf and told me she'd be back every Saturday to supervise production. I said she'd need to be here at 4 a.m. for that. She considered this completely reasonable. I found him asleep one morning in March. He'd come in at his usual time, poured his own coffee, because by then he knew where everything was kept. And when I came back from the walk-in cooler around 4:45, he was tipped sideways in the corner chair with his head back, and his coffee going cold beside him, and his breathing slow and deep in the way that meant the real kind of sleep. Not the defensive kind, but the kind you fall into when some essential part of you has finally stopped arguing. I turned the mixer down, I worked quietly, I let him be. He woke at sunrise. The disorientation on his face was the good kind, the kind that comes from having been somewhere too deep to track. He looked at the windows, then at the counter, then at me. "How long?" he asked. "Little over an hour," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't dream," he said. I put a plate of toast in front of him and went back to the morning loaves and didn't say anything to that, because some things don't need a response. They just need to be let alone to be true. He asked me about it a week later, not directly, which was unlike him, because Conrad Thorne was the most direct person I'd ever spent time with, which was simultaneously what I found most difficult and most reliable about him. But this he came at sideways, which told me it mattered more than he'd yet figured out how to hold. He asked what it would take, he said, for me to stop thinking of him as a complication. "Stop being one," I said. "I'm working on it," he said. "I know you are," I said, and I did. I had been watching him work on it since November, not by trying to become something different, but by slowly allowing himself to be what he already was when the damage wasn't watching. He put 2 fingers over the back of my hand on the counter, not holding, just there, just asking. I didn't move my hand. "I know what you've built here," he said. "I know what it cost you. I'm not asking you to hand any of it over." "Then what are you asking?" I said. He looked at me the same way he'd looked at the bread that first morning, like something he had not expected to need and had needed anyway. "To keep showing up," he said, "in your line, in the cold, whatever that's worth to you." I kissed him first. Over the bread counter, with flour on my apron, and the morning loaves in the oven, and the city, going gray into gold, outside my one clean window, he kissed back the way he'd started doing most things over the past few months, like someone who had slowly remembered that care was not the same thing as weakness, like someone who had decided that peace was allowed to be real. That was almost a year ago now. Stone and Rye has a line on weekends that goes past the corner. Fern comes every Saturday and has appointed herself my official head apprentice. She shapes a better boule than most of the culinary school candidates I've interviewed. Conrad still comes at 4 most mornings, sometimes before the front lights are on, sometimes after the first batch is already in. Some mornings I see him through the door glass sitting on the step first, just sitting in the Chicago cold, breathing. I don't open the door until he's ready. He always comes in. He sleeps now, not always easily, Not always without the old rooms finding him, but more than he did, enough. Fern told me once, very seriously, over a piece of proofing dough she was learning to read by feel, that her dad laughed more since he started coming to my bakery. I told her it was probably the rosemary. She said she didn't think so. She was right. The version of this story that travels around is simpler than the real one. People say I healed a dangerous man with bread, as if healing were ever that clean, as if men like him changed in one good moment and stayed changed. The truth was slower and messier, and involved a cast-iron skillet, and a 9-year-old girl learning to trust dough, and a lot of 4 a.m. conversations in a warm room, while the rest of the city was still deciding whether to wake up. I baked. He kept showing up. Between those two things, something built itself that neither of us had planned for. Some mornings now, when the bread is in, and the city is still dark, and Conrad is in the corner chair with his coffee warm in both hands, and Fern's drawings tacked above the register, and my name on the window glass catching the first light. Some mornings I think that happiness really does not arrive the way you would have chosen. Not in the shape you expected. Not on any timeline a sensible person would have designed, not safely and not quietly and not without cost. But it arrives, and when it does, it smells like rosemary and sea salt, and something warm just pulled from the oven. And the man in the corner chair finishes his coffee, and stays until the line builds, and stays past the line, and doesn't leave before I'm ready. And I've stopped pretending that doesn't mean exactly what it means.